Good evening. I'm Colonel Andy Taylor, the Honorary Curator of the Herefordshire Regimental Museum, and I'm delighted to be able to bring you this presentation this evening. I'm going to talk to you this evening about Army volunteer units in Herefordshire and the Herefordshire Regiment, with particular regard to Bromyard. And I will finish by mentioning a Bromyard connection with the Royal Navy. The story starts in 1860, when there was a perceived invasion threat to the British mainland from France, and it was considered there were insufficient regular and reserve troops available to defend against the invasion, and a new force, the Rifle Volunteers, was formed. Herefordshire formed a corps of the Rifle Volunteers, and here you can see an officer's cap badge of the Herefordshire Rifle Volunteers. The Herefordshire Rifle Volunteer Corps consisted of 7 companies, one in Hereford City, one in Ross and Arkenfield, one in Ledbury, one in Bromyard, one in Goodrich, one in Leominster, and one in Kington. The officers of the 4th Company were Captain Hopton of Canonfroom Court, Lieutenant Upfill, and Ensign Eckley. Each company wore a distinctive badge, and they adopted an animal as their motto. Here you can see the badge for Kington with a kestrel, and for Ross-on-Wye with a hedgehog. It is not known what the animal was for the Bromyard Company. The invasion threat disappeared, but it was decided to retain the Rifle Volunteer Corps, and here you can see some of the men of the Herefordshire Rifle Volunteer Corps at camp. Their main training was in skid-at-arms, musketry and shooting. To enable this shooting, each company established a range, and the Bromyard range was on the Bromyard Downs, behind the Royal Oak pub, as you can see on these maps. The range went back to 600 yards, which is a considerable distance for these early rifles, and gives an indication of the proficiency of the members. Some years ago, the Herefordshire Council Archaeology Department carried out a survey of the rifle range at Bromyard, and their report is available on their website. There were a couple of things which made the Herefordshire Rifle Volunteer Corps a little bit special. One of them was L Company, the cyclist company, as shown here. And the Herefordshire Rifle Volunteer Corps were one of the first army units to form a cyclist section, and they took part in the first War Department cyclist camp, which was held at Tintern in the Wye Valley. The other thing which made the Herefordshire Rifle Volunteer Corps special was the formation of the Bearer Company, as shown here. These were stretcher bearers, and they were trained in battlefield casualty evacuation and basic first aid. This was a new concept for the Army, to have dedicated men completing this role. Before the First World War, these men became absorbed into the Royal Army Medical Corps, the Welsh Border Brigade Bearer Company. In 1899, the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa, and it was considered that there were insufficient regular troops to fight that war, and volunteers were called for from the units in Britain. The Herefordshire Rifle Volunteer Corps and the Shropshire Volunteer Corps joined together to send a volunteer service company consisting of 120 men to South Africa. These men deployed for 12 months at a time. 2 volunteer service companies deployed, one in 1900 and one in 1901. This picture was taken in Bromyard on the 31st of May 1902, Pretoria Day, the day that the peace treaty ending the Second Boer War was signed in Pretoria. Those individuals that served in South Africa were awarded this medal, the Queen's South Africa Medal. It came with a variety of campaign bars depending on where the individual had served. The Rifle Volunteers attended weekend camps and generally a 2-week annual camp. And here are some photographs of their annual camp at Southampton in 1906. These photographs show the quartermaster's department and the cooks preparing meals on annual camp. By this time, motor vehicles were becoming more common, and the regiment hired vehicles to take with them on annual camp. This vehicle was owned by a stonemason in Hereford. The colour sergeant as the passenger was Colour Sergeant Bethel, who was a long-time serving soldier of the Rifle Volunteer Corps and later the Herefordshire Regiment. The Rifle Volunteers wore a khaki uniform, as you can see here, and the Herefordshire Rifle Volunteers were basically an infantry corps, and here you can see them undertaking a route march at their camp and also a rest period. Each company had a drill hall where they met and drilled on a weekly basis. In Bromyard, this was in Kirkham Gardens, as shown here. The building still exists and is now the home of the Bromyard detachment from Inkerman Company of Hereford and Worcester Army Cadet Force. As a result of experiences in the Boer War, there was a review of the regular army and the reserve forces. This resulted in 1908 the disbandment of the militia and the Rifle Volunteer Corps and the formation of a new reserve force, the Territorial Force. Included in the Territorial Force was the Herefordshire Regiment, and its locations on formation can be seen here. The Ledbury Company included a platoon location in Bromyard. Also of note is that Radnorshire was included within the Herefordshire area. The officer's cap badge was based on the city coat of arms, as shown here. The other rank's cap badge was taken from the lion at the top of the city coat of arms. The regiment's first annual camp in 1908 was a recruiting march around the county. The Hereford Times produced this illustrated supplement. There were also advertisements in the local papers encouraging individuals to join the Herefordshire Regiment, the Territorial Force. The new regiment was established and became part of the county's military fabric. In 1914, the First World War broke out, and the Herefordshire Regiment, as a territorial force, was called up for full-time service. Each soldier received this form, an embodiment form, notice to join, which was their call-up papers to report for full-time service. The railways played an absolutely critical part in the mobilisation of the forces. And here we see the Bromyard contingent lined up at Bromyard railway station, waiting to catch the train to Hereford, where they would join with the rest of the battalion and deployed to their war station at Pembroke Dock. Such was the enthusiasm for young men to take part in the war that between August and December 1914, over 3,000 men, mainly young men, volunteered to join the Herefordshire Regiment. There were no uniforms, no equipment, and most of the instructors had deployed with the battalion to the war station. The men undertook their training in civvies, mainly drill, at locations such as this, Castle Green. With all the volunteers joining, a second battalion was formed, and the regiment wore on its shoulder this brass shoulder title, Herefordshire, with a T above it. When the second battalion was formed, they wore that badge as well, and the first battalion was slightly miffed by this because there was nothing to distinguish them as the originals, and the commanding officer ordered them to file down the T on their shoulder badges to make it into a 1, as shown here. In April 1915, in an attempt to break the stalemate on the Western Front, other theatre of operations were considered, and one operation which did take place was that of the Dardanelles, or the Gallipoli campaign. The initial landings were on the 25th of April 1915, but they did not achieve their successes as hoped, and a secondary landing was planned for August at Suvla Bay, and it was this landing which the Herefordshire Regiment took part in. They sailed from UK on the ship the Euripides. They landed at Suvla Bay on August the 8th and immediately took part in an advance towards the Turkish lines, as depicted in this oil painting which is held in the museum at Hereford. They acquitted themselves well and were brought to the attention of Sir Ian Hamilton, the Commander-in-Chief, who published this dispatch praising their performance. The Gallipoli campaign unfortunately turned into another failure, and the men were evacuated in December and January 1914-1915. Over 1,000 men of the Herefordshire Regiment had served at Gallipoli. When they were evacuated in early December, there were only 80 fit men. 80 men had been killed, and the rest had been evacuated either through wounds or sickness. The regiment then went to Egypt to reconstitute, and having been brought up to strength, they then fought through the Middle East, crossing the Sinai Desert and entering into Gaza, taking part in the battles of Gaza. They were also based at Khan Yunis and Rafah, two places in the news at the moment. They were present at the liberation of Jerusalem at Christmas 1917. The battalion was transferred from the Middle East to the Western Front in July 1918. The regiment then took part in the final days of the war, the advance out of the trench warfare into open ground. After the armistice in November, they were a unit allocated to the occupation forces and were in the Rhineland. Those members of the regiment which served throughout the war received these 3 medals: the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal. The Star Medal is named on the reverse. The disc medals are named round the edge. If a star is named to the Herefordshire Regiment, then that man must have served at Gallipoli, as it is the only place they qualified for the award of this medal. In 1921, the territorial force was reformed and renamed as the Territorial Army. The Herefordshire Regiment comprised of 4 companies as shown here. The battalion headquarters was in Hereford at Suvla Barracks. The interwar years were a difficult time. There were economic pressures on the army as a whole, but also on individual households. But the Herefordshire Regiment continued to exist and thrive and attend annual camp. In the late 1930s, it was clear that war with Germany was coming. In 1939, the Territorial Army was doubled in size. This doubling was achieved by each unit splitting in half and forming a mirror unit. The Herefordshire Regiment formed the 2nd Battalion, as you can see here, and Z Company was established in Bromyard. The 2nd Battalion was allocated to home defence and never served overseas, although individuals from the 2nd Battalion went forward as reinforcements to the 1st Battalion and to other units. They also provided cadres of trained men to form new units. The 1st Battalion was part of 11 Armoured Division and landed over the beaches in Normandy on D+6, and then fought through France, the Low Countries and Germany, ending the war on the Danish border at Flensburg, where they took part in the operation to arrest Grand Admiral Dönitz and the puppet German government. No mention of the armed forces of the Second World War is complete without mentioning the Home Guard, made famous by the television programme Dad's Army. Although there were lots of laughs in that programme, the Home Guard were a serious organisation. Their role was, in the case of invasion, to delay the enemy forces so that the regular forces could be gathered together to counterattack and defeat the invasion. Many of the men had served in the First World War. They had battle experience, they knew the ground, and they would have acquitted themselves well. These pictures show a Home Guard parade in Ledbury. Many of the men were in reserved occupations. Many of them were farmers or in production or had specific skills. Many of them were older men who had seen service in the First World War. Many were younger men awaiting their call-up papers. Headquarters of the 2nd Battalion, a unit comprising of about 1,000 men, was in Bromyard. There were also subunits in Bromyard, and this photograph shows number 11 platoon. Other platoons and companies would have been spread around the Bromyard rural area. In 1944, by the end of the year, the invasion threat had disappeared. The Allies had landed in Normandy and were advancing across the continent. As a result, there was now no longer a need for the Home Guard, and their resources and manpower were required to support the advance in Northwest Europe. The Home Guard was stood down in December 1944. And here we see the officers of the 2nd Battalion of the Home Guard. This will include men from Bromyard. There was a specialist unit of the Home Guard called the Auxiliaries, and they were part of 202 Battalion, General Headquarters Reserve, photographed here. They operated in small patrols up to 10 men. They had hidden bunkers where weapons and explosives were stored, and their role in case of invasion was to hide away and then come out and act as a sabotage group, destroying key areas such as bridges, tunnels, communication centres, and the like. There were 7 patrols across Herefordshire, and one of these was based in Bromyard, Jacob Patrol. The known members of Jacob Patrol are named here. Jacob Patrol had their bunker on the Bromyard Downs, and in April 2016 the Herefordshire Council's Archaeology Department carried out a survey and an excavation of the bunkers. The report is available on the Council's website. These maps show the location of the bunker. It would appear that there were 2 bunkers or operational bases established, but the full detail of this is not known. This slide shows the generic layout of a typical bunker. However, they would be different depending on the geography where they were established. These are just a few pictures of the excavation of the Bromyard bunkers. I mentioned that the Home Guard was stood down in December 1944, and a disbandment parade was held on Edgar Street Football Ground, as shown here. On disbandment, there were over 7,000 men who were members of the Home Guard in Herefordshire. Very little is known about the Home Guard, as when they were disbanded in December 1944, they disappeared to their jobs, and the war in Europe was still going on. If anyone has any information about the Home Guard, then the museum would be pleased to receive it. In September 1945, the regiment was granted the freedom of the city of Hereford. A contingent of soldiers from the 1st Battalion in Germany returned to Hereford under the command of Major Crofts, who had been awarded the Military Cross. Following the Second World War, the Territorial Army was reformed, and the Herefordshire Regiment was renamed as the Herefordshire Light Infantry, and this was their cap badge, with the motto Manu Forti, with a firm hand. In 1952, the Herefordshire Light Infantry was deployed as shown on this slide. The platoon at Bromyard was part of C Company, which had its headquarters in Ledbury. In 1966, another review of the reserve forces took place, and this resulted in the Herefordshire Light Infantry being disbanded and 2 companies being retained as part of the Light Infantry Volunteers. The 2 companies were located in Hereford and Ross-on-Wye. The Ross-on-Wye Company had a platoon at Ledbury, and men from Bromyard paraded with that platoon in Ledbury. 1966 saw the end of a unit based in Bromyard, but the Army Cadet Force continued to parade in Bromyard and does to this day in the old drill hall in Kirkham Gardens. I mentioned that I was going to talk about a Royal Navy connection, and now's the time. Each town and city had a warship week. The aim was to raise money to pay for a warship of some sort. Depending how much money was raised, depending what sort of ship was allocated to support that town. As you can see from the extract there from the Bromyard News and Record, the aim of Bromyard was to raise £55,000 to launch HMS Vivian. This extract from the Town Council Minute Book shows the entry regarding HMS Vivian. The plaque was the crest of HMS Vivian, and when HMS Vivian was adopted by Bromyard, a plaque similar to this was given to the town council. Some years ago, an effort was made to try and locate that plaque, but it was not found. Here we see HMS Vivian. It spent most of its time during the Second World War on convoy escort duties in the North Sea, between Sheerness in the Thames Estuary and Rosyth. I have a personal interest in HMS Vivian, as my father, Able Seaman Jack Taylor, served on HMS Vivian for 3 years. This photograph of the ship's crew shows him between the two gun barrels. I remember Dad telling me that before Christmas one year, all of the crew members were making toys, wooden toys, and he was given special leave before Christmas to come home to Ledbury to deliver those toys to Bromyard. And he remembered getting the bus from Ledbury to Bromyard to deliver those toys. I wonder if anyone can remember receiving any of those toys, or whether any of them still exist. I have been pleased to be able to present to you this evening. The museum delivers a monthly podcast which covers various aspects of military history, the county history, and especially the history of the Herefordshire Regiment. If you would like more information, or if you have some information which you think the museum would like to hear, then please contact me as the curator through the museum's website. Thank you.